And thank you and welcome to another edition of MashTalk, Mashable's weekly Google Plus Hangout where we talk about the latest happenings in tech. I'm Mashable Senior Tech Analyst Christina Warren, and I'm joined by actually a really special panel today. As always, I'm joined by Pete Patchell, our tech editor. He is going to be back on the screen in just a second. I'm also joined today by Todd Wasserman, who's our business editor. Hi, Todd.
Hello.
Now I'm joined by Pete Patchell, our tech editor. What's up, Pete?
What's up? Wow, don't hit the wrong button on your MacBook, people. I hit the escape. Well, I didn't actually hit the escape button, but somehow it was an escape button. I got out of that.
That was embarrassing. And I'm also joined by Scott Wilson, who is the principal and founder of Minimal Design Studio, and he's you can find him at epicapplewatch.com. And the reason we have Scott with us today is because we're going to be talking about the truth about Kickstarter and kind of talking about crowdfunding in general. So just to kind of set the scene, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background, anybody in the audience who hasn't been following what's been happening over the last week or so. The big news this week is that the Pebble Time, which is the latest Pebble smartwatch, was announced. It's going to be out in May, and it made its debut on Kickstarter. The original Pebble was one of Kickstarter's biggest success stories. It raised over $10 million on Kickstarter back in 2012, and it was released to the public in 2013, and in the last 2 years has sold 1 million units. And so it literally went from something that was on Kickstarter and that 60,000 people backed into being a million unit plus device selling company. And so the Pebble Time has gone back on Kickstarter. They wanted to kind of revisit their roots, and to do that, they had a set goal of $500,000. They blew through that in I think about 17 minutes. They beat $1 million, but set a new Kickstarter record for raising $1 million in Kickstarter, and did that in about 47 minutes. And as of right now, they've already eclipsed the goal of the original Kickstarter Pebble Watch from 3 years ago. And so what we kind of have been thinking about, when in the context of this Pebble Time news, has kind of been where crowdfunding is and kind of the state of things and kind of what's happening in that space. And so we brought in Todd, our business editor, because he's written a lot and managed our reporters who've done a lot of great work on crowdfunding in general. And we brought in Scott because Scott, in addition to doing what he does at his design studio, and he's been responsible for designs of lots of products you've seen out there. He's an award-winning industrial designer. He's also responsible for a number of very successful Kickstarter and other crowdfunded projects. And so we wanted to kind of have this open conversation about what the truth is about these sorts of things. And so I think it'll be a really good conversation for us to kind of talk about the state of crowdfunding, kind of using this Pebble news to start with. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with Scott. If you just want to give us a little bit of a background maybe about who you are and what kind of your history with crowdfunding is, that would be great.
Yeah, so my background's traditionally or with product design, and I've kind of worn a lot of hats over the years. Done 3 consultancies, 4 corporations, and 5 startups now, and some of them were traditionally funded, but most recently used crowdfunding for our most recent startup, which is Lunatic. We kind of operate in 3 different buckets. We do fee-based consulting, we design the Xbox Connect, and we do all kinds of work for Dell, Intel, etc., all the big companies, but we also do ventures, based equity deals and royalty deals with bunch of startups, and then we also self-manufacture and kind of incubate our own brands, and so that's kind of the field of play that we participate in our firm. And then I think we, after exiting my last startup, which was, we went around the traditional way of raising money through friends and family and outside money. I just didn't have at that point in 2010, I just didn't have the energy to go running around the country to try to raise money for a little pet idea around turning an Apple Nano into a watch. So there was this little thing called Kickstarter that I was curious about, and I was wondering if I could raise $15,000, and ended up raising about $1 million in 30 days, and kind of changed the game. It kind of sparked both validated crowdfunding in general as a new alternative platform for raising money, as well as I think it kind of also sparked the wearables thing all at once, which was a fun point in time. But that's kind of my background. We're based here in Chicago. We just opened a San Francisco studio as well, just to be closer to all the exciting stuff that's happening in the Bay Area.
Great. Yeah, and as Scott says, and he's been modest, but the Lunatic and the TikTok, which were iPod Nano watch kits, launched in 2010, and it was really, I would say, Kickstarter's really big breakthrough moment, and it raised, like you said, about $1 million in Kickstarter, and really kicked off a lot of what we see happening right now. So one of the things that's happening, and Todd, I'm going to kind of go to you on this first, has been that there's been a lot of controversy over what happens when successful companies like Pebble use Kickstarter, or when we see filmmakers, we saw this with Zach Braff and with Rob Thomas and Spike Lee. It started with people like Scott, who maybe had expertise in an industry but just didn't want to go around the country kind of looking for investors. They wanted to do things on their own terms, or maybe they had an idea and didn't have maybe the connections to the way to do it, and it was kind of a way to kickstart your funding. Now it's kind of evolved into everybody kind of using it, even very established companies or established entities. Talk a little bit about maybe what some of the controversy is, and some of the things you hear from the criticism on for and against the way that Kickstarter is being used these days.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when you have an alternative band that you're really into, and then all of a sudden they become popular, and then suddenly they're not as cool anymore. I think that's a little bit of the phenomenon with Kickstarter. You can. I think with this particular thing, you can look at it and say, like, oh, do they really know? They really need to raise money via Kickstarter. They're not a struggling startup necessarily. And if you look at it, it's really for Pebble in this case, Kickstarter behaves more as a sort of distribution and marketing platform, which, in my opinion, so what? Who cares? If you want to support like a pure play fundraising entity, there are a lot of other ones out there right now. So bemoaning how Kickstarter has sort of changed over the years, for me, seems like a waste of energy.
What's your take on that, Pete? How do you feel about that?
Well, I basically think, here's the thing. I'd make another analogy. It's that if you've ever applied for financial aid at like a university or something like that, sometimes they have the requirement for some scholarships is like, well, you need financial need. And it's like, well, what if I'm not poor, but my parents are just dicks? Like, you kind of just put, like, where's the form for that? Like, I don't have the money, even though my parents, you got to fill out what does your parents think? Well, maybe a lot, but they're not giving it to me. So it's like, who are we to say, like, what's a struggling startup? Like, I know Zach Braff got a ton of flack for going to Kickstarter, because it's like, you're this rich actor to do this project. And the thing is, I mean, if you investigate even a little bit on how Hollywood works, I mean, even very successful filmmakers like Clint Eastwood have to go and beg studios for stuff, and even then there's so much meddling and approval and crap, and it's like, I completely get why anyone as part of that process would just want to go, you know what, I'm just going to Kickstarter, and then I can do what I want. So it's evolved. Kickstarter may have been this, starter is part of the name, a thing with people to start their companies and their projects, but now it's really a way you bring any project that you think isn't going to work in other channels, or in the case of Pebble, it seems very apt for Pebble, I gotta say, because they started there, and if any company is entitled to do this, use Kickstarter for just whatever, I think it's them. Because, for by and large, they kind of, there was very much when you have these big successful Kickstarters, it's good for the company, but it's great for Kickstarter, and like, so, it's like, hey man, come on back to the platform, do your thing. So there's a lot of controversy. I'm very much on the side of like, if it bothers you, get over it, and, go do something else, and, debate the dress.
Thank you. Scott, since you've actually been on Kickstarter and you've done a number of these projects, and obviously when you started, people knew who you were in the industry. This wasn't your first rodeo, it wasn't your first time. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to go on Kickstarter in the first place, and why you've continued to launch projects on Kickstarter and on other crowdfunding platforms?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, no problem. Like I said, it was early days. I'd found out about Kickstarter through my friend Scott Thomas, who had come off of doing the Obama campaign and did the book Designing Obama, and needed money for first run, and he raised $80,000. And I was like, interesting. I wonder what would happen if I put what I do for clients on this platform as a commercial product, and knowing how I know how to do things and all the back end that I know. And shortly after I started thinking about that, I think the guys, Studio Neat, the Glyph guys, came on board and raised like 140. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. So that's kind of why, and I mean, well, that's how it popped on my radar as a possibility, because I had this pet idea for the watch. I was just I showed it to the retailers like Apple, and I'd showed it to brands like Incase, and they kind of all passed on it, saying it was either too expensive or too complicated. So it was just going to die in my notebook or on my desk as a prototype. So I said, what the hell? And previously I'd come out of a bad exit on a startup, and I lost a lot of money, and there was no funds to do it on my own. So it's kind of like it was the only choice I had, and I didn't think going around to VCs and money just on a singular SKU was actually going to allow me to raise money on something that wasn't proven. I mean, it's not like Apple watches or Nano watches existed. It was nobody knew what people were going to do with this device that really didn't have a home. So there was a lot of reasons why, and at the end of the day, I just trusted my instinct.
And it worked. So it did because it was successful the first time. Did that change? Did that inform why you chose to go back to crowdfunding for additional kind of personal studio projects and other things you guys have done under the Lunatic brand and other stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there was a number of reasons to go back. My team, which honestly I was probably the only one that believed in it the first time, and the second time everybody wanted to be involved, So the rest of my team wanted to experience it as well. They all said I was wasting my time the first time. And I think it was like one of these things where, I was hesitant to do it because I felt like going back to the well was wrong, and I wasn't really thinking about it clearly, I think, and it was probably one of the most. It was a highlight of my career. It was so much fun, just going over and getting everything made without all the bureaucracy and process that I'd done with other big corporate clients and jobs before. And I think the end of the day, it was a lot less friction, I guess, and a lot more fun. And I think the other thing that people forget is that. I talked to Yancey and Perry a little bit about going back, and they almost said, and I told them I was hesitant to go back. I was speaking at a conference on crowdfunding, and they're like, don't you feel like you have to go back to really see if you can activate those loyal fans again? And, we've built up a pretty good community of loyal fans that love what we do, and they kind of want to be the first ones in and the first ones to get a glimpse at what's next and the first ones to receive it at a discounted price.
But do you need to go through Kickstarter to do that necessarily? Wouldn't your fans follow you anywhere?
Well, what we've seen is that about 70% of our 60 to 70% of our funding on Kickstarter Indiegogo has come from off-site, from our direct mailing list. Again, it's like if I had the time, I may, and we were actually looking at more of a professional kind of curated and accredited kind of crowdfunding platform ourselves right now as we evolve the business model we have. And whether you use like a Tilt plugin or an open Tilt, you can do it on your site, no problem, I think. But also at the same time, the crowd on Kickstarter is getting so big with, you name it, the project like the new Pebble time, it's getting to be a bigger and bigger community. The challenge with that is that it's not as curated of a community, so our loyal followers kind of get us and they understand that they're backing an idea to realize an idea versus buying a product off of Amazon. Whereas I think the bigger Kickstarter gets and crowdfunding gets, there's a lot of, it doesn't take but a hand kind of people that don't understand what crowdfunding is to get it pretty upset after a month or two of delays, which is normal in product development process, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. No, and I think actually that dovetails great into our next discussion, which is, what happens after a Kickstarter meets its goal? Why do we only hear about the success stories? And Scott, since you're the only, I've backed a lot of Kickstarters. I figured out earlier this week I've backed 40. in the last 4 years or so, and since 2010, the Glyph was the first thing I backed, and the Lunatic I think was the second, and we all hear about these success stories, but we also hear about the delays. But since you're the only one out of all of us who's kind of gone through the process, what happens after it's backed? And can you maybe walk us through the process and some of the challenges maybe with fulfilling something on Kickstarter versus when you're doing something either for a client or for your own kind of production schedule?
Sure. I mean, I guess it depends on the idea and how ambitious the idea is, and how much is it just hardware, is it hardware and software, and when you decide to pull the trigger on it, like where's your confidence level? I mean, I think we tend to want to be pretty confident that we can execute on something, and even though we've done only kind of what you call like cases and simple mobile stuff, nothing's really simple. The watch went off. The watch was, the fact that we crowdfunding that from start to finish in 90 days, and it globally fulfilled it within 90 days of the beginning of the campaign is kind of, I don't even know if I could repeat that again. Everything went without a hitch. I was expecting something to come out of left field the whole time, and the only thing that came out of left field was our fulfillment partner, who fulfills for the biggest company in the world. I thought that was like going to be easy, and actually they forgot to turn on tracking numbers and things like that. So I was like, how the heck did that happen? I expected me to for myself to have a problem. So, anyways, once you kind of raise that, and the follow-on projects, actually, we actually went through tooling, and we were pretty close. But what people also don't realize, sometimes tooling is a small percentage of what your investment's going to be. Like a tool may cost $100,000, but building the inventory for the Kickstarter crowd and retail beyond that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's actually $100,000 mistake is a painful one, but if you made a $500,000 mistake on building up inventory and nobody wanted it, that's even worse. So that's something you have to think about too, the total cost of what you're getting into. I think then once you raise that goal, raise the goal, then you're good to get the money, but you have to usually let the program run the whole amount, and then you typically get your money within 2 weeks of the close of the project. Actually, coincidentally, since nobody had ever raised that much money on Kickstarter back in 2010, the $1 million that came over to me via Amazon escrow got lost in the ether somewhere. They didn't realize that there was a limit of $450,000 being transferred, so we had to call in some engineers to find out where all the money went.
So it sounds like the plot of a Superman movie.
It does.
It's like exploiting a computer thing to just shave some money off things. So.
Exactly. So I think in the end, the challenge with the crowdfunding platforms is that you're kind of left there with no support afterwards. So here's the money, congratulations, go figure it all out. So mostly, highly recommend, if you don't know, find people that do know how to go and execute and bring it all the way to the shelf or to the consumer, because otherwise you're going to be learning, and learning is expensive, and it also gets kind of painful when the crowd gets kind of a little bit impatient. So, and there's more and more resources out there to learn about it. But on my projects, we tend to, as soon as it looks like it's getting traction, then we pull the trigger on whether it's making inventory or cutting loose on tooling and heading over to Asia or to the vendor in the US, wherever he may be sourcing it from, and start getting it done. At that point, it's nice because the vendor also, everybody in the supply chain is a little bit more confident at that point too. So that's an added benefit of crowdfunding, is that I remember when I went over there, the vendors who are like Nixon watch vendors, which obviously Nixon's a huge company, why are they going to pay attention to a guy that has a nano watch idea? But when they could see the $1 million publicly on Kickstarter, they were very, very motivated, and they got things about the whole opportunity.
Todd, I want to ask you, we hear a lot about these success stories, and we have occasional stories, we've written about them from Mashable, about, projects that either fail or don't go through, or that sometimes are even, outright scams. But it seems to be fewer and far between. We focus mostly on kind of the positive stories. Why do you think that is, and do you think that sets people up for unfair expectations about what it's really like to maybe either back one of these campaigns, or if someone is in Scott's position and maybe they're not as intelligent, they're not thinking about it, it's clearly not going through the motions, as well as someone like Scott is. They're thinking it might be easier than it is. What do you think about that?
Well, it sounds like, based on what Scott just said, that Kickstarter might think about offering a bit more guidance for these, people who want to do these projects. Maybe, vet them a little bit. I don't know, Scott, do they do any of that at all right now, or is it just what, anything goes?
Well, Indiegogo, what goes about Indiegogo is it's anything goes, almost anything, I'm sure. Kickstarter is a little bit more diligent about asking, certain questions about certain categories or banning certain categories, whether it's transportation or healthcare or they don't do not-for-profit and charity.
They could say something like, do you have a relationship with a factory? Do you really feel like you could produce X amount of these in a certain amount of time? It seems to be the problem a lot of times, right?
As far as I know, the extent of the filtering is and verification is that they want to see a prototype. So they don't want to see a bunch of glossy renderings only. They want to see a working prototype.
Mm-hmm.
But that's very. I mean, that's by far not enough, really. I mean, I think it's fine. I think they should probably look at credentials and who your partners are. I mean, like any VC, in some ways, they want to see what the team is, what the credentials.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if they have the bandwidth to do that, but it sounds like if this was if these things were blowing up left and right, that would be one thing. But it does seem like they're sort of the hidden hand of the market is taking care of a lot of those issues, right?
Yeah, I think we've hit walls, and we've had toolers and like agreements with vendors, paid premium dollars for a vendor, and then they go and outsource it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think with Kickstarter, people funding. I mean, first of all, the guys in charge at some point, I think it was about a couple years ago, they finally put out a blog post or something. Basically, okay, Kickstarter's not a store, which was like a good fair warning to all the people like Christina, who might not be as well read as Christina,
or as willing to waste money as Christina, who's just like whatever.
I really admire your attitude about Kickstarter, Christina. I think it's dead on. It's basically like, you spent money on dumber things, and basically it's really a bet. It's really you're playing poker when you're investing in Kickstarter. It's not investing, obviously. That's very clear. It's really like your money's on the table, and you might get it back, you might not, depending on how strong your hand or the person's hand who's designing this thing is. I certainly, in writing these things up and looking at prototypes and some of the production stuff over the years, I certainly woke up pretty early on to that. Like, Kickstarter is very much a mirage in some ways for a lot of projects, and Indiegogo even more so. That the sexy Kickstarter video was a thing for a long time. It still is, even though it doesn't get as much play. The telling the story of it, having some ex-employee from Apple or Google or whoever as sort of one of the architects and playing that up. Whoa, all this sounds great. It's like, and it's not pure. I mean, it's a great deal of frosting on something a cake that may or may not taste very good. And so once, I think the one that really woke me up was something called the Hidden Radio, which was basically a Bluetooth speaker, but it was kind of an ingenious design where you twisted it and it would reveal the speaker, and twisting it, it was like a big knob. Yeah, it was about the size of a Coke can, right, Christina? And it worked-ish. I mean, it didn't sound very good, and there were some pretty dumb design flaws with how the cable connected and stuff. So it was like one of those things where I was like, well, that all sounded good in your video, but this is not really that great. So the Kickstarter, and that's a success story, and then that was a Kickstarter run that was funded. It got to production. They made them. It was like even in retail, and it was still like So when you have, that's the success, and there's the stuff that's not written about, but when it is, it's very scandalous. Is this was funded, and the people involved really had no idea how to run a company, so they either built something that was crappy or it just never happened, which is usually the case.
Right.
And I really don't know. I'd honestly love to see a graph over time on how the percentage of those and of successfully funded Kickstarters that just fall apart, and how that number has changed. if at all.
Right.
Yeah. See, I would. That's why I would advocate the Kickstarter plays more of an active role for not for just for the consumers, but also for the vendors. You know, do you know what you're getting into? Do you want to be stuck with having to fulfill hundreds of thousands of orders potentially? You know?
Right. Well, the other challenge is that people, you can graph it out where these Kickstarter success stories or home runs are typically, okay, they sell 5,000, 10,000 units. That's considered a home run on Kickstarter. You know, in reality, in the real world of retail, that's like one PO to one customer for 1 month. So, but it's a huge undertaking for that little startup. They spend the next 90 days or 6 months or a year trying to fulfill that original commitment. Meanwhile, the market passes them by. Someone picks off their idea, gets around if they have any IP, and who has distribution and supply chain, and they're in the market, and then it's like a one-hit wonder. That's a non-sustainable business model for these guys. So, lining up that parlay into retail is just not happening right now, unless you're super experienced and and have that kind of lined up ahead of time. I think it would get there, but right now there's a gap.
I think that's a really important point. And actually, somebody in our chat, Martin Barkley, has a question for you, Scott. He says, for hardware-based projects, can you offer any guidelines about the relationship between the goal amount raised and manufacturing quantity? Is it better to specify a fixed quantity on an offer or to leave it open-ended?
Well, Pebble cut off their first one at 10,000 units because I think they freaked out a little bit. I remember when they turned it off. I think that should probably be an option because, like, there's a local blacksmith here, artist in town that does tableware for companies, restaurants like Next and Alinea, one of the top restaurants in the world. And he's a blacksmith and he makes like tableware. And he did this portal like alcohol infusing kind of flask and with glass sides, and he raised like $750,000, and it was a nightmare for us next year trying to figure out how to make that many, right? I think he would have been happy to just say, oh, I'll be happy if I just make 250 or something like that and cut it off, or a number of units. But yeah, that's a really good point. I think what your goal is. I just thought there might be, when I did the first watch, I just thought there might be a few other people, fanboys and some watch fanatics that might think it's cool. So that's why my goal was like $15,000, and I was hoping to maybe sell 1,000 or something like that, or several hundred. It wasn't that big of an investment to make, and luckily I had a watch vendor that was very experienced lined up already. So I'd actually sent it around to get quotes in the U.S. Using MFG.com. Got a lot of people asking for the quote on it when I sent out the part requirements, and actually a pretty high. I was willing to pay $30 cost for these aluminum parts, and everybody no bid in the U.S., which I was like, I didn't have time for that at that point to deal with it because I had 13,500 people to kind of fulfill for. So Asia was going to be the only route at that point.
Yeah. So kind of talking about this, and I guess I'll start with, we kind of go around the table on this, but what makes for a good Kickstarter from a consumer level? What happens? What do you guys think it is that makes a project kind of go viral? Whether it's something as like your project, Scott, or something like the Pebble, or even something esoteric, like the potato salad guy, or the Cooler Master. Is there something about Kickstarter is there a certain thing that kind of we could say kind of says you need a snazzy video or you need a snazzy concept? What makes a good Kickstarter? Pete, I'll start with you.
Well, I think there's an intersection of a few things in the Venn diagram, and I think quirkiness is definitely one of them. But quirkiness doesn't quite encapsulate it. Basically, it's something that probably either addresses a problem that either appears to only affect a few people or is simply appears to have a niche market. And a good example, I think, is the occipital structure sensor of a successful Kickstarter, because it was this iPad adapter that could do 3D imaging, and although various vendors, there's a lot of companies with expertise in that, including Google and the big tech companies. But for them to make an adapter wasn't really part of their business plan. You know, there was a reason that this expertise was fairly limited out there, but the demand that kind of product wasn't really something the people with expertise were interested in doing. And there were other people with expertise like Occipital, so they were like, well, let's fulfill this demand for mobile 3D scanning, and we can, you know, they worked out how to do it. They did, you know, the sexy video is like, if you don't have a sexy video, don't even bother. That is a must. That became a few years ago like Kickstarter 101. You got to have the cool video that's quirky and has some fun stuff in it. But I think it's that, and there's got to be a certain aspect of fun to it. There's got to be a certain amount of no one's done this or no one will do this. I remember sort of almost a little bit of a cool story, but a little bit sad, because there was a kid who wanted to build the biggest tablet ever back in 2012, and he went to Kickstarter and he had this whole plan. He was a sort of a kid genius, you know, a 14, 15-year-old kid who just like, I'm going to build this giant Windows tablet, and it wasn't funded, and it was kind of sad. But it was very clear why. Windows 8 was right around the corner, and everyone knew Windows tablets were going to be a huge thing in just a few months. So, you know, why fund this thing when, you know, clearly this demand is about to be met? So, you know, there's a few things, but I think really that kind of like quirky thing that, you know, there's demand for, that for whatever reason the major people aren't fulfilling. And I think Pebble really fit that. And obviously, Scott, your project before, I mean, no one was interested in doing tech watches in the way that, you know, your accessory did, and that's certainly not how Pebble did. But and even though everyone knew smartwatches and wearables were kind of becoming the thing, it took Pebble to really show, hey, this is the model. And now, you know, of course, everyone has a smartwatch, but Pebble, hey, you know, they pointed the way.
What about you, Todd? What do you think makes a good Kickstarter? Is there some je ne sais quoi that makes something work more than something else, or do you think that it's just kind of you know, hitting the moment at the right time? What do you think makes a good Kickstarter?
I think if you look at the top Kickstarters, it's really kind of a random list, which is cool. You could definitely see that if you have a celebrity involved, you're gonna get a lot more attention, you're gonna get a lot more success on the platform. But I think what's cool about Kickstarter is if you look at the kind of startup market, everyone's focused on software still. You know, it's still about making new apps, and there's a little bit of experimentation with hardware. But I think Kickstarter, what they've really sort of brought to the table is to have an outlet for these more hardware-centric endeavors. You know, so you know, you see one of the top Kickstarters of all time is a cooler. It doesn't even have to be a tech thing. And I think that's you know, sort of the purest, and what's really cool about Kickstarter is that you can try out all these different things and throw things against the wall and see what sticks. I don't think there's a formula that I'm sure somebody's writing a book about how to do a successful Kickstarter. You know.
Hopefully funded on Kickstarter, right?
Yeah.
Scott, what about you? What to you has represented kind of a successful Kickstarter, and is there anything you wouldn't? Are there any projects that you wouldn't want to fund on Kickstarter or Indiegogo? Did we lose Scott? I think we might have lost Scott. Okay. We'll see if we can try to get him back.
What would be interesting, I got to say, like, I wonder when no real gigantic company has come and done something on Kickstarter, you know, and they don't have to, but like what I was talking about earlier, like, is it for everyone? You know, there's probably a limit, and I got to say, like, if Google or Apple or anybody, you know, even a tier or two down from them ever would do a Kickstarter, I think we'd be like, okay, it's left the building. It's less cool than Facebook now. Even though, you know, I mean, I don't think we could say it's really for everyone, but.
Plus, if Apple did it, you know, that would be the richest kid in school getting this, you know, financial
right.
financial aid package.
Yeah. I think that's somebody's Apple size. Go on.
Oh no, I was talking to somebody at Apple at one point, and they said, you know, they were fascinated by the crowdfunding thing too. Is an ex-colleague of mine from Nike, and he's like, you know, if Apple pre-ordered something that they didn't say what it was. Here's our next greatest thing. It's gonna be $500. I'm not even gonna show you what it is. They could raise a. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's true.
But your question about the successful, sorry, I was losing you a little bit. Your question on successful Kickstarter. I mean, there's so many different elements to that, but I think it's like emotion, connection, and credibility, and of course network are really important. I mean, decisions are made on emotion, and stories are a great way to create emotion. So, at the end of the day, a story is a very powerful tool for this. But and then connection, like there's got to be. Sometimes it could be a quirky idea that just connects with people, and like, hey, that never existed before, or I relate to that guy or to that idea, and that fits a void in my life or a gap in my life. And credibility gives people the confidence to pull the trigger if they are thinking about it. And network, has always been like huge for getting the momentum. If you already have a pretty good following, like Elon, the guy who did Exploding Kittens, he had a huge, he and the guy he partnered up with had a huge network. And obviously Pebble had a mailing list of over 1 million people that they probably sent that out to, which I got one of them, and that just instant spike, and then the momentum is built, and it just keeps on building there. And I don't want to undervalue design. I think design we see a lot of Kickstarter's ideas that are good, but they just lack the design and the refinement, and they don't. They may sometimes.
Oh no, the Wi-Fi.
Oh no. It looks like we're losing Scott.
Well, I definitely agree with this point about design. I mean, I saw that in the Hidden Radio and others. But I got to say, yeah,
good design or refinement. It's it could have, and I think it's too many startups that have a cool idea and they can make it.
The Google, no, but yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right, Pete. Design definitely plays a big role in these things.
Yeah, I got to say, in covering Kickstarter, that I think is what hooked a lot of us journalists. I mean, certainly there's the story of the scrappy underdog who gets funding and yay, but I mean, a lot of this stuff just looks freaking cool, and it's like, why didn't I think of that? And it seems to me that Kickstarter, at least, back in the days, blogs would cover a lot of concepts from various designers, which was always fun and gave you good eye candy. But everyone knew none of this stuff would ever get made. And at least with Kickstarter, there's a chance, So it has a feels slightly better about writing that kind of stuff up. And particularly if, as Scott says, there's some credibility there and you have some confidence this might actually happen. So I think that kind of like the fascination blogs had with writing about design blogs or design projects moved sort of to Kickstarter, although now, and things like Indiegogo, although now there's so many, I've started kind of like, I think we've all sort of set a higher bar on sort of whatever Kickstarter we're writing about. There's got to be a little more to it than just, oh, this is cool.
No, I mean, completely. I mean, at this point, some of my friends who are in PR almost exclusively now work with Kickstarter or Indiegogo-backed companies, who literally their come-to-market strategy is to go on Indiegogo and is to go on these places, and then they have like professional PR people who are putting out their campaigns for them, and it becomes really hard to kind of stand out from the crowd. Mm-hmm. But I kind of we're running out of time. Kind of want to wrap this up and kind of ask you guys for kind of a last kind of question is where do we see this as going? Do we see, especially as there are now so many of these things, there's so many of these platforms, so many people trying to get on the bandwagon. Obviously, not everybody's going to be a success like Pebble or even Cooler Master or Exploding Kittens or things like that. But what do we think that is this going to increasingly kind of become a future way for people to fund things and for products to be made, or do we think this is kind of a blip in the pan? Todd, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I think what this Pebble project revealed to me was what a great distribution platform Kickstarter is. It's what they take a 10% cut, 5% for Kickstarter and 5% for Stripe. That's versus a retailer would take 50%. and you get a lot of exposure. From what I hear, you get your money pretty quickly, which is an issue with Amazon. I think you have to wait a couple months to get your money, and because these are donations, like Scott says, you get them in a couple of weeks. You get your money in a couple of weeks. So I think if you forget about the baggage of, this has got to be about funding startups, and think of it as a way to kind of distribute products and market them, I think it's kind of eye-opening. I almost wish they weren't called Kickstarter. They were called something else. They didn't have that connotation. So that's, with Pebble, obviously they're going to need to go to retail at some point or to become really, really big. But they've shown you can definitely build a nice business there.
Pete, what do you think? What are your kind of thoughts? What do you see as kind of the future of this stuff, and where do you think what we might be? Kickstarter's been around for about 5 years now. Where do you think we'll be in another 5 years?
Well, I think we're going to probably move on from crowdfunding, not altogether. I don't think it's going to end, but I think in terms of it being interesting and a very viable place for startups to start, I think that's going to slowly diminish. And I'm kind of seeing this in the same way, and I'll make a sort of very crude analogy to actually kind of the app market, where we're at a point where with crowdfunding, like apps, only the top 20, top 50 or so, in your app store really make any money, because the market is so saturated now. And you get things like Kickstarter where things like Pebble, bigger entities are in there. There's more projects all the time. It's harder to stand out. It's hard, and people only have so much money to throw at these things. Even except maybe you, Christina. But, so really, it's the bar for Kickstarter has been raised. I think that's pretty clear, and it's going to continue down that path. Maybe we'll see more crowdfunding sites. Some others with, we already have Indiegogo, and even a few others for very specific niches. But the crowdfunding thing is here. It's going to here to stay. But in terms of it being the way to really stand out, I think that's diminished considerably, and something new will come within the next 5 years. I don't know what that is. Bitcoin lottery?
Bitcoin lottery. Scott, love to close out with you. What do you see? You've been at this for a long time. Obviously, you've been successful with it. What do you think is the future of the space? And give us your predictions.
Yeah, I obviously I think using the crowd and pre-selling or whatever it ends up being, it's going to evolve. It's just the beginning days. I think it's a definite. For all the reasons we talked about, there's so many benefits here to the traditional only way to go to market, where you're giving up everything, you're bringing on traditional or institutional money or VCs or angels, and then at least you can go further down the line with it, and then you're still going to need that. And most companies at scale will need that. But then retail is tough, and this is the direct-to-consumer thing. It's a viable channel that's changing every day with more and more back-end resources to distribute products and services to kind of support this kind of thing. I do think the saturation and the noise is quite high now as far as the amount of stuff that's on the platform, and it's really hard to kind of stand above and stand out. I do think that there will be other things that kind of come out and are maybe more focused on certain categories, like we discussed here, and it may be a much more curated and accredited kind of platform where only certain design firms that have gone A to Z are linked up with inventors that are linked up with supply chain and linked up with retail. So you get a really truly A to Z kind of incubation, because nobody's really doing that right now. And that's kind of where we're heading right now with our model.
Great. No, I think you're right. I think there's a great opportunity for that, especially for people to know that they're going to have the potential to actually get what they are backing. Well, you know what,
Right.
You guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. We could talk more about this. We probably will in the future. I really want to thank Scott Wilson for joining us. Thank you so much, Scott. And we'll put links to where people can find you and find your products in our post and in the video links. I'd also like to thank Pete Patchell, our tech editor, for joining us as always. And Scott Wasserman, Todd Wasserman, I can't speak. And Todd Wasserman, I am mashing it up. Todd Wasserman, our business editor, for joining me as well. You can join us every week on at Google Plus every Friday at 2 o'clock, and we've got a SoundCloud version of this you can listen to as well. Please leave us your feedback on the video or on SoundCloud, and you can use the hashtag MashTalk to talk to us. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week.